Here are 50 facts about the most famous pharaoh known to the world as King Tut. Number 50. King Tutankhamun is best known as the Boy King because he took the throne at only 8 or 9 years old. This might seem ridiculous today given how most people wouldn't put a child that old in charge of a small household, let alone a massive kingdom, but in a hereditary monarchy you're stuck with what you got. And he came from a long line of rulers. Number 49. His father was one of the most famous rulers in Egyptian history, the legendary Akhenaten. Also known as Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten was famous for abandoning the ancient Egyptian religion and introducing a new faith known as Atenism, after the god of the sun, and coincidentally the god he was named after. It completely upended Egypt's culture and the religion was quickly replaced with the old one after his death. But who was the other half of Tut's bloodline? Number 48. In ancient Egypt, they kept it all in the family. Tut's mother was unknown until DNA testing was done on a female mummy known only as the Younger Lady. Turned out she was not only Akhenaten's wife but his sister, who was the mother of Tutankhamun. This was surprisingly common in ancient Egypt because, after all, who was supposed to marry a pharaoh? Some commoner? Better to stick with someone you know is royal. But Tut's ascent came with some complications. Number 47. Tutankhamun was still a boy, albeit a wildly powerful one, and he had an empire to rule over. As he was so young, he obviously had no experience in statecraft, so he relied on his advisors. So much of his reign was directed by his vizier Ai, a powerful advisor to his father. Anyone who's seen Disney movies probably assumes that Ai was plotting to take over the throne himself, and he was, but not how you might think. Instead, the wise man simply positioned himself as the closest advisor to the king and made himself indispensable. And sure enough, he wound up being the next pharaoh. But how did an advisor rise to the level of pharaoh? Number 46. Tutankhamun took the throne at 8 or 9 years old, meaning he could have had a reign of more than half a century, but it wasn't to be. Life was short and cheap back then, and he only ruled for 9 years, dying at only 18 years of age. While there are no actual medical records from the time, there are any number of things that could have killed him, from a chariot accident to any number of long-running health issues, because King Tut was not a healthy person. Number 45. When Tut's mummy was eventually found, Egyptologists were able to investigate Tut's roots for the first time, and what they found was shocking. Most media portrayals of Tut usually show him as a powerful, strong young kid. In fact, he was actually a very sickly boy, born with ailments including a club foot that required him to walk with a cane. He also had a cleft, hard palate and scoliosis, ailments that could have been alleviated today, but back then could have drastically shortened his life. But were any of these the cause of his death? Number 44. Investigations with the mummy also showed some unusual physical traits that could have been associated with a chromosome disorder like Marfan syndrome. Additionally, genetic markers for malaria were found in several mummies, including Tut's. But maybe the most likely solution is a very simple one. There's evidence of Tut having a badly broken leg, which could have easily been fatal due to blood clots having no cure in ancient Egypt. But why did he leave no heirs? Number 43. Dying at 18, you might not expect Tut to leave behind any heirs, but ancient Egypt was a very different place. He was married to his paternal half-sister, Ankhesenamun, and she might have been up to 7 years older than Tut, and they had children together, but neither survived. One was lost late in pregnancy, while a set of twins died shortly after birth, and so at the time of Tut's death, he left no heirs and a wide-open position for his advisor. But he did manage to make a name for himself while he was alive. Number 42. By the time he died, Tut had managed to undo one of his father's biggest reforms, the change in religion. He restored the traditional polytheistic pantheon and reopened many of the classic temples. The odds are this was more the result of his advisors pushing for it. Akhenaten's decision was largely disliked by the majority of Egyptians, and Atenism never caught on. And once its supporter was gone, it was back to the status quo. Of course, the fact that he was personally affected by his father's decision might have changed things. Number 41. The famous name Tutankhamun was not always his name. When he was born, he was named Tutankhaton, which stood for Living Image of Aten. This was another way for his father to try to give his new religion a legacy, but it might have backfired. His new name, taken when he took the throne, replaced the sun god with the traditional Amon, king of the gods, as a symbol that his father's reign was truly over. But the world of monarchy is fickle. Number 40. Tutankhamun might be a figure many of us recognize today, but this was not the case for ancient Egypt. In fact, his death spelled the end of a dynasty, and he was succeeded by Ai for 4 years, who was then succeeded by the army chief Horemheb. This era of non-dynastic rulers sought to erase any trace of what came before, and many of the names of the 18th dynasty pharaohs were removed from tombs. In fact, Tut was all but forgotten until the early 20th century, when he became a worldwide obsession. Number 39. The Valley of the Kings in the Giza necropolis wasn't fully explored in 1922, with some tombs being fully opened and others being completely obscured. Excavations began after the development of Egyptology in the 19th century, and many new tombs were found, but Tut's tomb seemed to have been lost to history until a small pit was discovered featuring objects bearing the boy king's name. It was the first clue they had to the location of the tomb, and they were close, but they weren't the first to get there. Number 38. By the time it was opened, Tut's tomb had been robbed several times. Given that his dynasty had fallen out of favor with his successors, it's no surprise that it was looted soon after his death. Initially, it was repaired and refilled with goods, but the second time saw only a quick restoration followed by the tomb being sealed away out of view. Flash floods in the region only helped to bury it further. But it wasn't the kind of tomb many pharaohs had. Number 37. Why wasn't King Tut's mummy housed in a pyramid? His royal tomb is anything but modest, but it wasn't anywhere near the epic size of some of the greatest Egyptian tombs. When he took power, he immediately began commissioning a royal tomb, but it turned out he had much less time to build it than he expected. But even if he had lived longer, he might not have wanted a pyramid. They were associated with a previous era of pharaohs, and this more modern dynastic had different and less ostentatious styles. Plus, time was ticking. Number 36. According to the Egyptian traditions, Tut was supposed to be buried within 70 days, and his death took everyone by surprise. So it's likely that he was buried in a noble's tomb instead of a king's tomb, and the priests were able to perform the rites that would send him off to the afterlife, even though he did not get a royal resting place. But it wasn't going to be the last time he'd be seen. Number 35. Who was the man who uncovered Tut's tomb? That honor goes to a team, but the groundwork was laid by Theodore M. Davis, starting in 1912. An American lawyer and businessman who explored the Valley of the Kings in the early 1900s, he was the one who discovered the pit, containing many artifacts belonging to Tutankhamun, although not the tomb itself. When he found a small chamber containing pieces of Tut's chariot, he thought he was close but never found the actual tomb and soon gave up work. And that laid the groundwork for the big find. Number 34. It was 1922 when Howard Carter, a British archaeologist, picked up Davis's work and started exploring the area again. His team's first job was to clear the area of all the debris down to the bedrock, a painstaking job and one that would make the valley clearer than it had been for thousands of years. And that made all the difference because on November 4, 1922, they found a single step, and Howard Carter began the descent into history. But a find like that doesn't come without help. Number 33. Carter may have been the brains of the operation, but he couldn't have done it without the funding he received. Being a British aristocrat comes with a lot of free time, and one man named George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had a taste for adventure. He decided to spend his resources funding Egyptology expeditions, and he was the one who made it possible for Carter to launch the most exhaustive search for Tut's tomb ever conducted. And what they found was unprecedented. Number 32. Much of the tombs found by archaeologists before have been from either much earlier eras or much more modest. The discovery of Tut's tomb was unprecedented in how well preserved and how much of a time capsule of a Middle Kingdom royal burial it was. While many of the goods within had been damaged by moisture over the last few thousand years, other items were shockingly well preserved and provided much more insight into Tut's life. What they found inside has been the subject of extensive study ever since. Number 31. One of the most significant finds was a detailed embossed picture of King Tut and his wife, found on top of a box. This was one of the clearest images ever found of the young king, although it's not clear if it was an accurate representation. After all, if you were designing a picture of a teenage king, you'd probably want it to be as flattering as possible, but this has heavily influenced the public perception of Tutankhamun ever since. It also gave us some interesting insights into how he lived his life. Number 30. It was well known that Tut lived his life with serious health issues, including a club foot and possibly chronic back issues due to scoliosis. But a statue of him found in the tomb showed him walking with a cane, which indicated that it was probably an everyday part of his life, and those memorializing him didn't shy away from it. This was actually a contrast with how the wheelchair-using President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was usually depicted thousands of years later. But the people who built his tomb didn't make it easy to find. Number 29. Inside his tomb, they found 4 different funerary chapels. These holy sites turned the entire tomb into a little bit of a maze, and it wasn't until they got to the innermost one that they found his sarcophagus. This may have just been creative design worthy of a king, but it also might have been designed to protect the most sacred parts of the tomb from grave robbers. And it worked because the mummy was still there thousands of years later. But it wasn't the only security measure. Number 28. You know those Russian nesting dolls? How many of those are in there anyway? Well, nested coffins might be the latest trend in that. Tut was buried in a sturdy stone sarcophagus that upon closer investigation actually contained 3 different coffins. The top 2 layers were primarily wood-based coffins that had been gilded with gold and jewels, and the final coffin actually containing his body was made of solid gold. And the tomb had more secrets than that. Number 27. How wealthy was King Tut? If his tomb was any indication, very wealthy. While most information about his reign is gone, the team headed by Howard Carter found over 3,500 artifacts which took 10 years to fully catalog, and many of them were made of precious metals and jewels that would be extremely valuable today. But some of them stood out from the crowd. Number 26. King Tut's burial mask was a whopping 20 pounds of solid gold, enhanced with jewels and other precious metals, and is probably the most famous artifact found in the tomb. Today, it's the item most associated with the boy king. And it wasn't the only item with a lot of glitz. Number 25. A golden king deserves a golden throne, and Tut's throne found in the tomb didn't fail to deliver. It's not clear if this was an actual throne he used during his reign or just one that was provided as a ceremonial accent, but it was another impressive item made out of precious metal, complete with animal faces on the armrests. But one item found in the tomb raised more questions than it answered. Number 24. A pectoral necklace was one of the most ornate and well-preserved artifacts found in the tomb, decorated with symbols including a sacred scarab and the Eye of Horus. The amulet at the center was considered a mystery, as no one could tell what substance it was made of, until it was identified as natural glass from the Great Sand Sea. The most common theory was that this was glass formed by a meteor strike. But this wasn't the only tie to the sky in the tomb. Number 23. The pyramids of Egypt often had a very specific layout designed to align them with the stars, and Tut's tomb was no exception. It was built so the constellation of Orion would be directly overhead, and Orion was believed to represent Osiris, the god of the afterlife in Egyptian mythology, so they probably hoped that this god would be watching over Tut well into the future. And there were some more mundane discoveries in the tomb as well. Number 22. Tut's orthopedic issues were well known, and there was even proof of it in the tomb. Not only was he buried with 130 walking sticks, just in case he still needed them in the afterlife, but he also had a collection of orthopedic sandals that were easy for someone with a club foot to walk in. But not everything about the tomb was perfectly planned. Number 21. When Carter was exploring the tomb, he noticed some odd pieces of wood on the floor, still intact after all these years. After exploring the sarcophagus, he discovered that the largest inner coffin was made too big to fit in the stone sarcophagus, so the toes of that coffin had to be shaved off at the last minute. We're guessing that designer had a bad day at work. We even got some interesting hints at the boy king's hobbies. Number 20. When exploring the tomb, Carter discovered an interesting artifact, an ostrich fan, which contained alternating white and brown feathers. While the feathers didn't pass the test of time, they found the handle of the fan which depicted the king going off on a hunt, likely for ostrich. Not only did he likely bring down big game, he probably ate well in the aftermath. And one item was a true mystery. Number 19. One dagger found in the tomb didn't look like the rest of the artifacts and was still intact and sharp after thousands of years. No one could tell what metal the dark dagger was made from until later tests showed it was made from a shard of a meteorite. It wasn't believed that the Egyptians could craft weapons from such a material, so either they could do more than we knew, or a later civilization got into the tomb and left a souvenir. And of course, there was one piece of evidence that provided more information than any other. Number 18. While the burial chambers of many pharaohs in the pyramids have never been uncovered, Tut's body was found, and scientists were able to investigate it closely. It's one of the best preserved mummies ever found, and it's answered a lot of questions and raised quite a few more. And there were quite a few unique things about it. Number 17. Typically, the mummy contains the heart because the Egyptians believed that the heart was the core organ for thought and emotion, not the brain. So before burial, they left the heart within the mummy while the brain was removed. But in this case, Tut's heart was missing. It's possible the heart was damaged or that it had taken so long to bury him that it had degraded. And the canopic jars buried with him weren't typical either. Number 16. The canopic jars, which contained the organs that would cause the mummy to rot more quickly, were usually inscribed with images of the gods, but in a very atypical move, the jars buried with Tut contained his image instead. And there were other strange things around his body. Number 15. While most mummies had a typical grayish pallor, Tut seemed to be dark black, almost like his body had been burned. It took a while to figure out why, but now it's believed that the resins and oils inside the tomb could have caused a chemical reaction when exposed to oxygen, leaving behind a mummy that looks burned. But the mummy was so well preserved that some major discoveries were made. Number 14. Tut's mummy had a fully intact anatomy, and that made it clear that whatever had led to his death had been bad. There was serious damage to his rib cage and his pelvis, injuries that were deadly during that time. The most common theory is that he might have met his end in a chariot crash, a fitting end for a king who was essentially the James Dean of ancient Egypt. But there was one other injury that raised more suspicions. Number 13. Was King Tut murdered? An X-ray of the mummy in 1968 found fractures of his skull, as if his skull was shattered by a blunt object. This led many people to believe that he might have been murdered. After all, he was surrounded by scheming advisors and ambitious generals. But evidence seems to point to another theory. The crack in the skull wasn't there when he was alive. It was either caused by the embalming process or resulted due to archaeologists removing the burial mask. And there were some other shocking discoveries in the tomb. Number 12. He wasn't alone in there. His deceased children were in there with him. Studies of the tiny bodies indicate that at least one of them had a severe skeletal birth defect that made it impossible for her to survive long after birth. And the mummy kept providing answers. Number 11. King Tut's mummy provided a surprisingly complete DNA profile, and that allowed scientists to start comparing it to other mummies. Not only did they find one match, they started tracing back a whole Egyptian family tree. Starting with Tut's mummy, they identified his father, his grandfather, and his grandmother, and now have the map of the dynasty going back 5 generations. And the rediscovery of his tomb would only increase his fame. Number 10. After the tomb was fully excavated for the first time over decades, a public interest in Egyptology went through the roof, and it only increased once they were available to be seen by the public. In the 1960s and 1970s, they were kept on display in a museum in Egypt under the name Treasures of Tutankhamun, but their biggest starring role was yet to come. Number 9. Starting in 1972, the exhibit went on a worldwide tour. Some of the artifacts were put on loan by Egypt and were sent around the world to museums in the USA, France, Canada, Japan, even the Soviet Union. Millions got to see the remnants of the boy king's reign for the first time, and that's how he became a massive pop culture figure. And that would manifest in some strange ways. Number 8. Since his discovery, King Tutankhamun had a big influence on international culture, which started as soon as the tomb was opened. Even the president of the US, Herbert Hoover, only a few years after the tomb was discovered, became so enamored with the story that he decided to name his dog King Tut. Multiple songs were written about him, and even products were named after him. And there was almost a resurgence. Number 7. The year was 2018, and King Tut was about to go tour the world again, starting in Los Angeles in an exhibit titled King Tut, Treasures of the Golden Pharaoh. It was the largest exhibition yet, featuring more than 100 items, and it had popular showings in New York and Paris. But just as it was about to head to London, the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, and the exhibit was canceled. Back, the treasures went to Cairo, where they're now displayed permanently in the Grand Egyptian Museum. But there was also a dark cloud lurking over the tomb. Number 6. Could King Tut's tomb be cursed? While the scientists certainly didn't believe anything supernatural was going on inside when they opened it, after that a series of strange misfortunes started befalling the people who were inside, and soon that became yet another element of Tut's legacy that gripped pop culture. And it all started with one of the biggest names. Number 5. George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was celebrating the archaeological find of his life when he was befallen by a misfortune that was fairly common: a mosquito bite. It itched, so he scratched it relentlessly, and that developed into a nasty infection. In 1922, treatment was still not where it is today, and the infection soon spread. The Earl became the first victim of the supposed curse of the pharaohs, only 4 months after the tomb was opened. And the curse wasn't done yet. Number 4. Powerful railroad executive George J. Gould I, the son of a massive railroad businessman, went to visit the tomb in 1923, and only a short time later he developed a nasty fever that he had contracted from his time in Egypt. Soon, he too was dead, and the many people who had visited the tomb started getting nervous. Within the next decade, excavation member A.C. Mace and Howard Carter's secretary Richard Bethel would both die as well. However, there was one key piece of evidence which disproved the curse. Number 3. Howard Carter himself, the man who opened the tomb, went on to revel in his newfound fame and fortune and lived healthily for another 16 years after opening the tomb. When he died in 1939, he was 65 years old, not an atypical age for a man to die in those days. But that didn't stop people from claiming he was yet another victim of the curse. Hey, makes for a good story. But the discoveries are still coming. Number 2. In 2014, scientists took the next step and took over 2,000 computer scans of Tut's mummy and any other evidence they had to create a realistic computer-generated image of the boy pharaoh, and the result was a rather ordinary-looking young man, far from the dreamy boy usually portrayed in the media. But maybe the most surprising thing about Tut is how he was forgotten for so long. Number 1. As Tut was the last ruler of his dynasty, his successors had a vested interest in erasing his impact. But even beyond that, it seems his impact might have been minimal. He only ruled for a few years and didn't achieve anything major for his reign. But once his tomb was discovered, he became a legend. Guess it goes to show all it takes is some impressive swag and a good story. Want to learn more about ancient Egypt? Watch Evidence Reveals How the Pyramids Were Actually Built, or check out Real Reason Ancient Egyptians Went Extinct instead.